Today is Sunday, December 29th, 2024, and this is episode 290 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Kalat.
Good evening or afternoon, Jerry. How was your Christmas?
It was amazing. How about you?
It was good. It was good. It was a little quiet. It's just my wife and I and the three cats kind of chilling, but unlike you, who had a full house of family and cats and dogs and kids and craziness.
As I said online, it was way too much peopling. way too much.
Perhaps that is the way it should be. I don't know. And I won't say exactly, but we're very close to, I think, your 84th birthday. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm getting up there. I look pretty good for almost 90, right?
The bathing in the blood of your victims, I think, is working well for you.
There can only be one.
So, a non-committal date. Happy birthday to you. How's that?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Just a quick reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and not those of our employers, not necessarily at least. And one more shout out to our Patreon donors. Thank you so much. And by the way, look, we do this for free. We don't take sponsors. We don't have any advertisers yet. We do incur costs that we pay for out of our own pockets. But if you would love to support us, you can do so at our Patreon account. It's patreon.com/defensivesec.
Yeah, we would love to have you. We're thinking about doing some special rewards for Patreon donors. Let us know if that's of interest to you. Drop us a line. We're thinking about maybe, for those who contribute a certain amount, we could do like a Zoom call or something if that would be interesting. Or, you could pay us to not call you. I don't know, whatever it takes.
We're flexible. Flexible.
But
all right.
To echo Jerry, thank you for those who do support us. We very much appreciate it.
Definitely. All right, getting into stories. The first one comes from Bleeping Computer, and the title here is FTC orders Marriott and Starwood to implement strict data security. So for those of you who may not recall, Marriott and Starwood hotels, who, again, are part of the same network, were back a number of years ago, were the subject of multiple security breaches, back to back. I think there were three really high profile ones, but I think there were a couple of other smaller ones, including, by the way, one really egregious one, which was against their loyalty program. So, you can bank your hotel stays and get free reward or get free stays. Those, for a lot of people, ended up being stolen. So, as part of their settlement, which I think they've paid tens of millions of dollars in fines already, but as part of their settlement, they have to implement a security program for at least the next 20 years, which is, by the way, a standard fare for the FTC. For those of you who don't know, for whatever reason, I don't know if there's some kind of statutory limitation that limits how long the FTC can do something, but 20 years is pretty much what they always do.
That's about how long it takes to, make some real changes at a big company.
It's true. Although they have to implement the changes we're going to describe within the next 180 days. So 6 months from December 20th, they have to have all this stuff up and running.
That's aggressive for a big company.
Yeah. Now, hopefully, I'm assuming, by the way, that they're not just starting today. I would assume a big company who's had a number of breaches has been making improvements for a while. And so they probably already have some things they can take credit for. But So the first thing they have to do is establish, implement, maintain a comprehensive information security program that encompasses encryption, access controls, multi-factor authentication, vulnerability management, and incident response plans. They must maintain policies to retain personal information only for as long as reasonably necessary, which, by the way, is becoming a common data privacy law requirement. So interesting to
Yeah,
see.
define reasonably.
Well, therein lies the problem, right? That is one of the big issues I have with almost all security guidance. Is it's so squishy that you can drive a bus through it, and
Yep.
so like I might need it, and therefore it's reasonable to keep it. But obviously, that's not what they're what they're going for here. They have to implement logging and monitoring of IT assets to detect anomalous activities and security events within 24 hours. I don't know, within 24 hours just doesn't sit well with me for some reason.
Did you go read the actual
No, I did
published
not.
article? Yeah, the actual published finding is sometimes these articles abstract a little too much, and the way I read it was that they need to investigate an alert within 24 hours.
Okay. That makes sense. That makes
Yeah.
much more sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. See, look at that. You're prepared.
Hey, look, don't get used to it. It's a Christmas miracle.
All right. Conduct independent biennial assessments of their information security program for 20 years and report to the FTC any identified gaps that are addressed.
Or
And that, by the way, is one of those uncomfortable things when you have to go and declare your problems to the government. They have to provide a method for U.S. consumers to review suspected unauthorized activity in their loyalty rewards accounts and restore those points in cases of a breach, which
you would like to
seems
think that was already there.
obvious. It's weird that they had to call that one out. But and then finally, inform the FTC within 10 days of any required notification to governmental entities about security breaches. And so I think the issue there is the FTC's got they've basically put Marriott and Starwood on a short leash, and so anything that happens may be an indication that they've deviated from from this set of required actions, which could subject them to further penalties.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a lot of thoughts reading this one. There's a lot here we could dive into, but in the interest of time, I'll just pull out a couple. I'm always curious when these cases come up, how many of these things were the security department wanting to already do and just weren't given the budget or the backing or the support to do it? I mean, not to make too many guesses here, but typically I see most folks in security programs want to do the best they can. They care. They want to secure the company. They're not naive. They're not, lazy. They just typically have a lot of challenges, whether it be risk tolerance of the company isn't aligned with what they want to do, whether it be budget, whether it be focus, whether it be staffing, whether it be they're busy working on other things that take all their time. There's a lot of different things that go into this. So I do wonder. I would love to know, how much of the "I informed you thusly" was going on after this came out. It's tough to know.
It is difficult. I think I can see, I can almost hear a discussion about how their rewards program isn't subject to PCI.
Right.
I don't know why. I can hear that echoing in my mind.
Well, it's funny, and I don't know. I'm not an expert about these sort of reward programs, but I've bumped into these enough that there's sort of this weird pseudo currency equivalent thought process around some of these rewards programs that I think builds in some weird additional expectations other than uh, as I've seen from previous just watching these sorts of things and participating in many of them when I used to travel extensively and that sort of stuff. It's interesting how they sort of treat these as somewhat Like they have actual value. Like the fine print has a value per point, and it's so. I wonder if that some of that comes into it.
Perhaps. I think that there were. I suspect lots of people were harmed in the breaches that they had, and so I suspect there were some high expectations that the government would do something in response.
Right.
And so I'm not surprised to see it, but I also suspect that, I don't know that. I mean, I'm stumbling over my words, but I suspect that this was not an expected outcome for them. Like I'm going to guess that there weren't a lot of expectations that the FTC was going to come after them because of problems with their rewards program.
Yeah.
And this is one of those examples where, like, you don't know when and where and how it's going to happen, but like getting that leash put on you is incredibly uncomfortable. And I think
I
we're going to start seeing more of this.
look. I want to be clear that we're not judging anyone's personal
No,
habits
correct.
and what you do in your free time
Just
is
remember to
not
have a safe word. Just remember to have a safe word. That's right.
right. All right. So I
Yeah.
pulled out a couple of snippets from the findings directly, and I thought the language of how these were written was interesting.
Okay.
The first one was safeguard number 6, developing configuration standards to harden operating systems and network devices in Marriott corporate network segments and other non-property network segments against known threats and vulnerabilities. Here's the part I found really interesting. New operating system and network devices introduced to such segments shall not be approved for use in Marriott IT assets until they meet respondents' configuration standards.
Oh, wow.
So that gave a big stick to security. Like you can't go live with something until we sign off on it.
You know, some of these sound so highly specific that it leads me to wonder if this wasn't the product of like
Oh yeah.
government agents interviewing
Oh yeah.
people at their security program. Tell me what went wrong.
Right. What would you like as your new power out of this?
Right. Tell
Well,
tell me what went wrong.
listen to the language in this next one. This one's a little lengthy, so bear with me. Number 9, establishing, implementing, and maintaining vulnerability and patch management policies and procedures to maintain, keep updated, and support the software of Marriott IT assets containing personal information, using measures that take into consideration the impact a software update will have on Marriott IT assets, data security, Marriott's ongoing business, network, and operational needs, and the scope of the resources needed required to maintain, update, and support the software. There's a whole lot of caveats in there. It goes
Wow.
on. Marriott shall implement and maintain processes and procedures to schedule, install, updates, and security patches on that software in a timely manner. What's timely? That's always an interesting question. That require confirmation that any directives to apply patches or remediate vulnerabilities are received and completed, and that include timelines for addressing vulnerabilities that account for the severity and the exploitability of the risk implicated. So again, another big stick handed to security, which I'm wondering if like they felt they were being ignored in their vulnerability management program asks to other departments.
Yeah, it is also interesting. They aren't prescriptive about time frames.
Right. And there's a whole lot of like take into account impact, amount of, this feels like a very carefully worded, negotiated finding that has a lot of wiggle room.
Certainly sounds like it.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Anyway, those are just two interesting ones I pulled out of how I really wonder how those conversations went. And to your point, was this something that they interviewed folks and said, what would you have done to avoid this? What could you have used in your toolbox? Or
Right.
in what mandate do you need to make sure this doesn't happen again?
I mean, either that or the FTC has some super smart people that were able to infer all of these things. But I
Yeah.
think Occam's razor says that, like you've said, they probably knew what needed to be done, and this is, that they pulled out their laundry list, and now it's a matter of effectively regulation for them.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So,
FTC
interest?
consent orders are not to be trifled with.
No, no, and I think you can get in some serious trouble if you don't pay attention, and even worse if you try to if you try to obstruct or obscure that you've not followed them. So
So, for good or ill, the security team and the IT team now has a very strong mandate that really cannot be ignored for most of the organization if they want to survive. Here's what I think may happen, though, is that other departments will learn to go right up to that line and no farther. They know exactly what's in that order. They know exactly what they're required to do, and that's as much as they're going to do, uh, and nothing else.
I think you're right, but I guess let me play the devil's advocate on that. On the other side, I would assume that the leadership of the company is super hesitant to fall afoul, like to attract attention again. So while they the process of complying with this order is going to be expensive in taxing and whatnot. And so, they're not going to be, there's probably not going to be a big appetite to go beyond it. But at the same time, like if something happens again and it was the result of something maybe not, directly addressed in the order or somehow adjacent, like I think it's not going to go well. And I suspect the leadership of the company is not going to tolerate that. But I think for me, the one of the points is that, like, you lose control of your destiny. IT has become kind of the secret sauce for a lot of companies and how they um how much money they invest in IT and security and whatnot, as a competitive advantage. And when something like this happens and the government comes in and lays out these prescriptive consent decrees, you lose a lot of that flexibility.
Yeah, I agree. And often, like I saw this when I worked in banking. And for those watching on video, by the way, Caesar has come to visit to participate in the podcast. So if you see a little black furry cat head, that's
I see
Caesar.
I see some ears.
Yeah, he likes to get up on my desk occasionally. Uh, I saw this a little bit in banking, where also once you have this sort of heavy regulatory environment, most companies are somewhat reluctant to go outside of what they know the regulators will approve. So they're
Hmm.
usually not very interested in cutting edge. They're usually not very interested in exploring new innovative ways of doing things. They want to be very conservative and safe, which could be a competitive disadvantage at times
Yeah, yeah,
because you want to keep your regulators happy. And if you're doing something regulators don't understand, that's not always a good conversation to have either, because what they don't understand, they're usually skeptical of.
right. It's a very good point. Very good point. All right, let's move on to our next story, which also comes from Bleeping Computer. And the title here is Security Firm's Chrome extension hijacked to steal users' data.
This is an ugly one.
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to have to walk back all of my jokes about turning on auto patching or auto updates.
It does feel like that's suddenly biting us when we've been preaching it so often.
So the story here is a company named Cyberhaven, who I've never heard of before, has a data loss prevention plugin, browser plugin for Chrome, and obviously it's intended to help avoid data loss. They list as among their customers the likes of Snowflake, which I don't know why that makes me giggle. Motorola, Canon, Reddit, Amera Health, Cooley, IVP, Navan, DBS, Upstart, and Kirkland and Ellis. So
I
a lot
wonder how
of
many. I wonder how many of those companies gave permission to be included in that list.
I don't. It's a good question. Hopefully, hopefully they all did, but I bet they're finding out. So anyhow, what happened is sometime before Christmas Eve, so just days ago, the administrative account for Cyberhaven's Google Play Store, sorry, Chrome Store account was compromised, and the adversary uploaded a malicious version of the browser, this browser plugin, which had as part of its its uh, malicious code, uh, sending exfiltrating things like passwords, authentication tokens, cookies, that sort of thing, to a third-party malicious site, which had a domain name which kind of mirrored the Cyberhaven name. So this was like not a accidental or a target of opportunity. Like this was, I think, a pretty concerted effort to target this specific plugin, and it appears like it was taken down after a relatively short period of time. But again, it's one of those things that auto updates. But in the context of a company, it's hard to say how many people actually would have had their work computers on and updating and whatnot. So really unclear how how many people or organizations were actually impacted by this. But it's an interesting attack vector. I think we've seen like ebb and flow of malicious browser plugins, gosh, over the past 20 years at least. And usually it's things like popular browser extensions that are run by like an individual who sells it to some kind of adware company. It's usually something along those lines that we've seen in the past. But this is a little bit of a new take on that. Now, what is further interesting is that this was not the only browser plugin that was targeted apparently by this actor. There's a security researcher who was basically looking at the infrastructure used by the actor to collect the information, and they found at least, I think it was four other plugins that had similar code released in a recent version update that was exfiltrating information, although those seem to be more targeted at like consumer individual type people. So interesting. Obviously, if you are a customer of theirs, you should definitely take some action, like terminating any sessions that your browser has trusted with, changing API keys, passwords, that sort of thing. Great, by the way, another great example of why it's important to use something like phishing resistant credentials, because this would have not been affected by that.
Right. Or at least not as a, yeah, wherever you use those would have been, yeah, less likely to have been a problem. In this case. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting case. Clearly, the bad actor must have done a lot of recon, a lot of planning. I'm curious how much they mirrored the plugin's functionality. Right? Did they just have it look like it still was doing what it was supposed to do, while also grabbing and sending credentials off site, or was it purely just a spyware tool? I don't know. We didn't get into those details, but the other thing I found interesting was some of the other tools that were mentioned as having this malware injected into it. Like you said, were somewhat more consumer based, but not necessarily. Like, a couple of VPN, earning points through surveys, information search tools, specializing in text and seamless note taking. So, hello, Noki. For those curious, we had a Noki setting. Caesar wandered off. So for customers of Cyberhaven, I can understand why they had that plugin installed, and I get that. It does what it needed to do, and you need those sorts of things. But these other ones look more, leads me back to, should we be letting, in an enterprise environment or a business environment, users choose their own browser plugins? and manage your own browser plugins. And I'm keep trending towards no. But I mean, you need to have an IT organization that can handle it and can deal with maintaining that responsiveness to be able to push out plugins that are approved. But we keep seeing plugins be a source of pain. This one, I don't know that you would have avoided it if you were a Cyberhaven customer, especially if you had, your Chrome was updating on a regular basis and updating extensions on a regular basis. I still feel that auto updating saves more problems than it causes, but nothing's perfect. But I go
Yeah,
back to, I go back to maybe we should be managing the extensions that our browsers are using.
so I was mostly kidding about rethinking auto updates. I think auto updates are still far more useful than they are dangerous. Even if you encounter problems from time to time. I mean, and sometimes, by the way, they're big problems. So, like CrowdStrike and even not Petya going way back. But I think that on average, those are exceptionally rare instances, and they get a lot of attention when they happen. But it's on average, I think you're better off auto updating for sure. I do think it's becoming increasingly dangerous to operate unauthorized or unverified code, including browser plugins, on corporate workstations. I don't. I think we're going to have to accept at some point it's the risk is too great, and maybe that's not a one size fits all statement. Some companies may just have a higher tolerance for risk or less to lose. I don't know, but here we are. I think the other side, by the way, is looking at it through the lens of Cyberhaven. They aren't harmless here. We don't know exactly how they lost their that their administrator credential to the Chrome plugin store. But I'm going to guess it's probably phishing.
They did say it was a successful phishing attack on an administrator account for the Google Chrome store.
Okay. But which then tells me, was that because they weren't using multi-factor authentication? Or
I don't know what the Google Chrome store offers.
Yeah, I don't know either. But I'm going to guess. I'm going to bet it uses Google's normal authentication scheme. So most of their services do. So maybe it was a more sophisticated phishing attack. But again, this is probably an example where phishing resistant credentials or phishing resistant multi-factor authentication is becoming increasingly important, especially where you have something like this that creates, is something that would be an attractive target. And
I also wonder if companies realize the risk around these accounts, and are they appropriately guarding them, or is it somebody in the engineering department who just pushes updates, who doesn't think about it from a security or risk perspective, and it's not that big a deal?
Well, I'm guessing they're rethinking that at Cyberhaven right now. But it's a good point. It is important to think through all those points of risk, and some of them might not be super obvious like this, but it can bite you and your customers. So
one last thing I was curious about is, I wonder if any EDRs or anti-malware technology would have picked up on any of this. I doubt it, but I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah.
Really good question. I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah, it's something that I go back to, like when they do these pwn to own contests. I'm like, great, now do it again with state of the art EDR and see if any of it gets stopped. No, okay, EDR companies, go work on that. Or it does get stopped. Great, good job. Use that in your marketing or whatever. But I'm always curious about that. Like, how effective are these tools?
Yeah, it also is unclear to me how they found it. So it sounds like it wasn't live for available for download for all that long. So which means to me that somebody found it, and I don't know the means by which it was found. That's not clear at all.
Yeah, it's not.
All
Anyway,
right, the next story comes from Dark Reading, and the title here is "Emerging Threats and Vulnerabilities to Prepare for in 2025." So lots of the standard fare, but some new things to think about. One
these
is
stories drive me a little crazy, by the way. I just want to say that up front. They drive me a little crazy.
I know that. That's why I picked it.
Thanks. I am effectively triggered. Good job.
You're welcome. So first is zero-day exploits, which I guess is not new, right? It's kind of always there.
I will say the only thing that I've seen change recently is for a while we felt 0 days weren't going to be burnt on random low level, non nation state, non high value attacks. That seems to be changing. We do seem to see more using of 0 days for uh, run of the mill attacks, which is interesting to me. It's changed the equation a little.
Yeah, we covered a story a couple episodes back about how I think it was among the most commonly exploited vulnerabilities were 0 days. So I think you're right. But look, I think you have to kind of put them into different buckets because, like, as I think when some of us think about a 0 day, we're thinking like, iOS Safari escape plus a sandbox escape to get into, versus, like there's a cups vulnerability or there's like a vulnerability in your Palo Alto firewall that is hanging straight on the internet. And so I'm not sure that like it's you can think about it as one homogeneous whole. Like there's I think there are certain types of 0 day vulnerabilities that are being withheld and used to to perpetrate very targeted attacks. But then I think there's also like a class of like infrastructure, I'd just call them infrastructure type vulnerabilities that are used to hack en masse, and things like you know Log4j and Snowflake, and there's lots of
Yeah.
examples recently.
Yeah. And just to give a little context for listeners, the thought process is once you use a 0 day, it's burned, and that the manufacturers can patch against it. So it
Right.
loses its efficacy. I don't even know if that's true because people don't patch quickly. But that was always a thought process. It's why you see things like people looking for iPhone vulnerabilities, like up to $1 million, they'll pay for them. Like they want it for something substantial. So yeah, that class of stuff where you don't. The theory has always been that once you use it, it starts to lose its efficacy very quickly. I don't know. Maybe that's changing.
Uh, well, I think I think that just this is the world according to Jerry, right? I think one of the one of the big things that is big economic changes that has happened in attack tactics is how they're used. In the past, I think a lot of these vulnerabilities were thought of as means by which to get into organizations and facilitate APT style attacks. And I think more and more we're seeing these 0 day vulnerabilities not being used to like spy on people or perform corporate espionage, but to like do effectively smash and grab ransomware attacks and stuff like that, where like it's the value is not in like getting deep into one person or one organization necessarily, but it's like trying to almost like a spam attack. Like you're sending your spam to as many people as you can, hoping you get a couple a couple of people that fall for it, so I think that's one of the big dynamics that has changed. And by the way, this is one of the concerns I have is, as countries become much more sophisticated in their cyber operations, like their offensive operations. They're developing really sophisticated techniques to attack, their enemies, their adversaries. But that doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? The ransomware operators and like everybody is watching what's going on, and every time
Sure.
one of these operations gets detected and decomposed by some super energetic security company trying to make a name for themselves, like those a lot of those techniques are adopted and embraced in this. So I think that's one of the reasons we see the world that we do right now, because I mean, obviously not all of those techniques are being used, but I think it's also, I blame in part the use of 0 days on threat actors, like commercial threat actors, trying to mirror what they see being effective in the nation state space. Now, I mean, that maybe I'm naive there, or sky is falling, but there you have it.
Well, I think there's an interesting corollary there, or at least a thought that occurred to me as we're talking about this. I know we've only gotten through one of these. We'll go faster. Uh, there's also very noisy attacks, which gets the press, which is what we're in essence reacting to. We're seeing that sort of survivorship bias of these are the types of attacks we're seeing. For the low and slow, quiet stuff, maybe we're not hearing
True.
about it, or it doesn't bubble up as much. I mean, we do have this very huge telco intrusion, supposedly from China, supposedly going out, supposedly can't kick out. It's not getting much press. We don't really know. Supposedly they're using backdoors. We don't know. There's a lot of unknowns there. Um, so you wonder how much of that is deep penetration that's sitting there very quietly, that isn't motivated by a ransomware attack, or something similar. So it's not noisy. It doesn't make itself known.
Well, I think I can't disagree with that. I think a lot of the more advanced adversaries, unless their objective is destruction, you don't know that they're there, until somebody makes a mistake or gets lucky.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
next is supply chain attacks. We I I'm almost getting uncomfortable with the term supply chain attack, because it's become such a broad topic. Like almost everything is a supply chain attack now. And so it's almost lost its meaning to me. But I think the point is, when you are consuming code in your code, or they call out the SolarWinds breach, right? And certainly that was a huge, still to this day, a really huge issue. Um, and I am concerned, as I have been for years now, that the most problematic supply chain, or any, pick your avenue of attack, is going to be the IT infrastructure management tools. And like
Sure.
we've seen it with Active Directory for years. We saw it with SolarWinds. And I think we see it on and off again with things like Jenkins and whatnot. But I really think that this is where we are going to continue having a lot of problems, because I don't think we spend enough time. Like, those are becoming, inside our organizations or respective organizations, those are becoming our critical infrastructure. And I just don't think that a lot of organizations treat those with the care that they require.
No. Same. We've had the same thought of a lot, like vulnerability management tools or whatnot that can talk to everything in the environment, usually with administrative level access, right for
Mm-hmm.
manipulation and exploitation. I agree. Uh, One thing I did take away from this segment is this is, and to be clear, this is riffing off of a webinar that was held with different people sort of giving their opinion on these things. So, just sort of quoting from the article, the complexity of modern supply chains make it challenging to secure all the dependencies. This underscores the need for rigorous third-party risk management. Okay, sounds great. What
Get
does
your
that mean?
spreadsheets out.
Right. Show me a rigorous third-party risk management that would have caught a phishing attack against a Google Chrome extension store plugin manipulation. How are you going to pick that up? How's that going to work? I'm so disenchanted with third party risk management. It feels like just a bunch of window dressing and security theater.
It's
I mean,
effectively a platitude, right? It's like, it's do good stuff.
I don't disagree with the concept of, hey, you should vet your suppliers and what they do. And, maybe there's value in saying, yeah, show me your SOC 2, show me your ISO, show me that you've gone through these third party audits that I can trust, et cetera, et cetera. But boy, it just feels like a ineffective process to me right now.
Well, so just to carry on with what you were saying, those things are informative, but they're not, they're not complete. So just because someone has a SOC 2 or an ISO SOA, or they have a PCI report, or whatever, it doesn't mean that they aren't also susceptible to falling for, as you pointed out, that getting the credentials to their Chrome store account phished, right? That there is not a lot of, there isn't a program that's going to give you that level of insight. I think, that there's programs that will give you some indication about like the general health of their program. And so that's where I think some of the value in like those bit site type or security scorecard type reports, which I actually personally hate. Like, it's like,
I hate them with a passion.
Coming from a cloud provider, I really
They're
hate
so
them.
inaccurate. They're so inaccurate.
But the aspiration is to help you understand what their general practices are. But the reality is, I think they tend to be kind of far off the mark in terms of like, what they're targeting and reporting on.
Yeah, I don't have a better solution, by the way, to be fair. I feel like it's a false sense of,
yeah, it's one of those, like, we've got to do something. We have to do something.
Just do something. And I feel like it's a false sense of security. I really do.
And so because we have to do something, there's lots of companies standing around ready to take your money, ready and willing and able to take your money to help solve that problem. Meanwhile, every time something happens, we do the big spreadsheet dance.
Right.
So
anyway, I know we're burning a lot of time on these, but
remote work infrastructure exploits. Look, this is, I think, not entirely novel, but I think, as we've talked about ad nauseum over the past couple of months, the things that we put at our network edge, your Fortinets and your F5s and Cisco's, these things are not paragons of security unto themselves. And, if you are not careful in how you manage them, I have personal experience that tells me a lot of attacks happen because these devices are not maintained. Like, companies buy them and they're expensive to keep support on. And I think there's this view, well, it's just a firewall. Like, it passes packets or it doesn't pass packets. Why do I need a support contract on this? And that works until you get hacked. And anyway, that was one of the most common ways I saw suppliers, smaller suppliers especially, getting hacked, was through their out of support Cisco and other branded firewalls. But look, that's a big problem. Exploitation of AI and machine learning systems. This is, I think, a new, an up and coming risk. And by the way, I think that there's, as I talk about in this little snippet, there's multiple flavors of this. You've got, and I think the next article we have is also expands on this a little bit more, so I won't go too far into it. But you have AI as a means to perpetrate attacks, but then you also have AI as like an attractive nuisance where you can inadvertently lose data or create other problems. So we get into that more.
I also think if you're a thought leader, it's a fun boogeyman to blame all things on as a magical black box of unknown risk.
Oh my God. Some of the people talking about how this is like going to be civilization ending is pretty incredible.
Obviously, these articles drive me crazy because it's just thought leaders being thought leaders and just throwing a bunch of buzzwords out. Typically, by the way, that's related to whatever business they are involved with and how they can sell you a magic black box to fix it. I'm not saying there isn't value in looking ahead, and I'm not trying to rip on this particular article or this particular webinar. There's so many buzzwords, and there's.
Mm-hmm.
This is why I don't do predictions, because I don't know how well anybody ever gets them right.
Well, it'll be fun to go back and take a look. Although, when you kind of stack all these up, there's not a lot that doesn't fit into one of these.
Right, sure. What's the risk model I care about as a modern company? Here you go.
So, if I'm predicting the stock market, I'm going to say, well, like some parts of it are going to go up and some parts of it are going to go down, and like at the end of the year, I'm going to be right.
That's true. I'm looking for a good place to say this, but I'll just say it here. I think once again, don't get distracted by the new shiny. Get your basics right.
Yeah.
And then worry about the new shiny.
So the other one, just kind of skipping around, there's a couple that I did want to focus on. One was API security.
Yeah.
I'll lump that in with cloud security misconfigurations. Look, that's where I came from most recently. And this is not like a slam on cloud providers. I think it is more an issue that like the API economy is not mature. And a lot of these are exposed directly to the internet. They're not well thought through in terms of what the potential problems can be. And we've seen that in spades over the past couple of years with not necessarily like breaches, but like abuse, where an API that was, offered for legitimate purposes was being abused for illegitimate purposes. And I think we're going to see more of that. But then there's also issues like I'll go back to the Capital One breach, which was, a while ago now. But I think that the problem that exemplifies, I don't think we've seen the bottom of. Like, I think that we're going to see a lot more of these because the cloud providers keep innovating at a increasing pace. Their environments are getting more sophisticated and complicated. And I think it's becoming more and more difficult to understand and wrap your head around how to keep these things, secure, let alone the fact that we keep having just like the basic S3 bucket problem continues to be a massive problem. And let alone, now that we have all these complex IAM policies, which by the way, we did an interview with Chris Dodson and talked about that at length on Getting Defensive. If you want to go listen to that, hint, hint.
Shameless plug. No, I was just going to mention, not to mention the authentication side of this for non-human interfaces and that sort of thing has its own set of complexities that we're not handling well yet.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't disagree. I do think it's an area of unmanaged risk for sure.
So their forecast for ransomware I thought was a little bit interesting. And it says some threat, this is a quote, some threat actors have moved to deleting data as part of their normal motions. He says, if this gains traction in 2025, organizations will not have a method to recover by simply paying the ransom and hoping to get a working decryption tool. The only method of recovery will be backups. However, data shows that backups do not typically survive these breaches.
Well,
So
that's an interesting statement, right? So if I know you've deleted my data, why would I pay you to unencrypt it? So that's sort of there must be more to that story. Unless it's like, hey, we've got an off-site copy of it that we'll send back to you. Might be part of the ransom.
I can only assume that that is, but that doesn't scale well, especially like if you think about if you talk about like a file server, that
Right.
kind of makes sense. But like if you're talking about an environment where thousands of workstations have all been ransomware, like that doesn't
Yeah.
that doesn't work.
I I understand the exfiltration aspect of it, and then extorting you to pay so I don't exfil this to the public. But I don't know, this threw me off. The other thing I thought that was interesting is backups not surviving. I have noticed that most of the major cloud providers are now offering services that are uh, sort of like one-way backups
Mm-hmm.
that are they have terms for it. I'm trying not to get too buzzwordy here, but where the backup is somewhat separate from your account and it's abstracted from your account, and you can pipe backups into it, but you can't modify it further. Like, so a bad actor couldn't go in there and then delete stuff and modify stuff. Now, I'm assuming in the instance of you need to recover, you'd have to go work with the cloud provider to give you that information back. But it seems to me that some of the cloud providers are starting to try to build some services for this sort of problem, where somebody not only deletes your main data set but your backup set, because it's usually within the same account typically.
Super important that you take advantage of that if you can, because I've said it before on this in our other shows. One of the big problems I saw when I was in cloud is customers having a misunderstanding about what kind of recovery was possible without the customer taking some kind of overt action to back up their data.
It's not
Uh,
just magic.
it's not, it isn't just magic. I will say the other concern I have, and it's an unfounded concern. So just I'll put that caveat out there. Cloud providers unto themselves are becoming an increasing like concentration of risk, and so there's the old joke about how cloud is just somebody else's computer, and at the end of the day, it's not wrong. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that, and when you look at a cloud from the outside, it looks pretty homogeneous and whatnot, but behind the scenes, it tends to be pretty heterogeneous mishmash of different technologies put together, and so it's like not necessarily easy. Like you wouldn't you wouldn't see a normal kind of a worm have success under the covers in the cloud, because there's so many different types of technologies under there. But the reality is like those cloud providers are becoming, I have to imagine, an increasingly attractive target.
Sure.
And
Now
so yeah.
you would hope it's also a concentration of defense.
Oh yeah,
We,
absolutely, absolutely. But
but
at the
yeah,
same time, like if you're scoring off, if it's AWS scoring off against a foreign intelligence agency, like
yeah,
it's tough. And the reason I say that is that things like the write once read many, the cold backup storage, where those typically are presentation layer concepts. Like at behind the scenes, they're just hard drives. and and so if someone were able to compromise the underlying systems that host those things, presumably they would be able to delete it. And now you're at the point of having to really rely on the security that the cloud providers are providing. And I think, as far as I'm aware, we haven't really seen, and I don't count the Azure, some of the Azure, like the Office 360 stuff is like a, in this bucket. We haven't seen like a major breach below the line in a cloud provider like that, at least that I can recall. But I've got to believe that, like, there's a lot of, jiggling of door handles. So anyway,
something your mom's door handle, something. Go on.
I had to happen sooner or later.
That's what she said.
Glad you got that out of your system. All right, Our last story comes from Security Week, and the title here is "Beware of Shadow AI, Shadow IT's less well-known brother." When I read this, I was taken back to the interview that we did on Getting Defensive, shameless plug, with Dave Shackelford, who talked about a friend of his who was a CISO that recently resigned because at least the assertion was, concern over AI. And I think it's a broad, probably broad, lots of different reasons why that happened. But for me, this feels like trying to hold back the tide.
Yeah.
And I say that because, like, these are not necessarily even apps that you install, or there's websites that you visit. They're on your phones. They're on your, like, they are becoming so pervasive that it's a problem. But anyway, the whole, the point of this article is that, we generally lack governance around user-driven use of AI technologies.
Mm-hmm.
We're certainly seeing, and we complain endlessly about how companies are embracing AI and displacing workers and whatnot. But that's not what we're talking about here. That we can debate that all day long. This is more where employees are taking it upon themselves to identify and use AI technologies in furtherance of their jobs, and the risks
isn't
that creates,
authorized,
right,
or sanctioned or provided by a corporate IT department.
Correct. And so this article goes through some of the risks that are associated with that, such as data leakage. When you've got employees who are, one of the great examples, that I don't, it's a I'm just going to put out as an example. I'm not saying this is necessarily a problem, but, like, there was a time when Grammarly was a big plugin for email and for your word processors. But as you were typing, it was not just all happening in your browser. It was actually sending whatever you typed off into Grammarly's cloud. And if you didn't have an agreement with Grammarly to transit confidential information, like, that could create a problem. Like, not even just a security problem, right? It could create a legal and contractual problem, because if you're typing something that has this covered under a non-disclosure agreement, or some kind of trade secret, or what have you, you could be creating inadvertently a serious problem. Or if you were typing up case notes for a medical provider, like, you're sending HIPAA covered data, or GDPR covered personal data to a provider. And so I think that's, one of the big issues I see is not even necessarily kind of core security risk, but, like, legal risk. And then when you talk about on the generative AI side, you got lots of people now starting to use AI to write code. And one of the big complaints about generative AI is that it's basically stealing code. And I'm using the word stealing in scare quotes, but it's, it's not writing necessarily the code completely on its own. And so then you get into the question of who owns the code that your employee had their AI agent write.
Yeah.
When you as a company go off and find, some kind of AI technology to help your developers write code like that, that's on you, the company, to work through that issue. But when it's something being driven by an employee, and then suddenly, surprise, you're being sued for, I don't, to my awareness, this hasn't really happened yet, but I can envision at some point companies being sued for, trademark or patent or some trade secret infringement because they incorporated AI provided stuff into their code base unknowingly.
No, I agree, but I also feel like, back to your first point, you're screaming into a hurricane. This is just going to keep happening, right?
Yes.
Because everything in its brothers got AI integrated now, and it's almost a panic by all of these providers to integrate some level of AI to stay competitive in their mind.
Right.
And I think for our employees, an existing tool suddenly turns on AI, they try it. They're like, hey, this makes my life easier. Great. And they don't know or care about these problems. That's not their problem to solve. So, but it's also very, very difficult to police this without some pretty heavy oversight. And yeah, I think the reality is some bad things are probably going to happen before most companies take this seriously. It
I
sucks,
agree,
but
but I don't know what the end game is. This article recommends some, some responses like robust AI governance policies, paired with education and granular access controls. But I think this space, as you kind of alluded to, is moving and evolving so fast. I don't, my head spins when I think about, like, what would a policy say?
and to be clear, I think taking that to the next step, you've got a policy that says you can only use company sanctioned AI tools, and here's a list. Okay, great. Now, how responsive is that company to integrating new tools? Or even understanding that a new tool got introduced to an existing approved tool, or that a new version had a massive AI overhaul? Or are we now becoming uncompetitive because we're not using the latest version of something that our competitor is using? Do we just have to accept some of this risk to stay competitive? I
Mm-hmm.
don't know that that conversation is even being had, much less what the right answer is. I, it almost feels to me, and this is very old school, but it was back in the day when we first started with SaaS tools. And there was a mindset of, hey, anything that's internet connected is not going to be acceptable to us. Well, now you can't get away from it. Every piece of software is internet connected in some way. I
Mm-hmm.
think the same thing's going to happen with AI. It's whether we in security like it, love it, hate it. I don't know that there's a lot we can do to stop it if we wanted to stop it. And by the way, it may not be the right call. It may be the right call for business to have this skill set and capability available, and we've just got to deal with the fallout. But I don't know that any of us understand what that is going to be yet, and I think it's going to be a painful learning curve.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, other than turning off the internet, I think this will be a very difficult thing to uh, to to manage. One of the concerns I have with the AI governance policies and the employee training is that you're putting a lot on the employee. Now, look, not everything is advertised as AI, right? And
Right.
so I think that's when I read this, that's one of the concerns I have, is that AI is becoming so pervasive. It is in so many different things that when an employee uses something new, it almost certainly has AI in it, whether they know it or not.
Yeah. And it's being built into the core of the operating system. It's being built into their phones. It's being advertised every which way from
Exactly.
Sunday as a normal, appropriate function. So if I take this to the nth degree and I'm a young hotshot developer and I can't use AI coding tools, do I want to be at your company?
Right.
And that is a very real consideration for the flip side of this argument. If we only look at it from security risk side, we're missing the entire other side of this argument, which is what's the upside? What's the benefit? What's the perceived benefit? And this is a freight train coming down the tracks. I don't know that I want to get in front of it. Even if I know it may derail, I,
Yeah.
it may just be one of these things that, right, wrong, or indifferent, we've got to just manage through it and see where this all ends on the other side, because I don't think it's stoppable at this point. And I don't know that it should be stopped. Honestly, I think
Uh,
there is value.
yeah. I think at some point, and look, we've joked a couple of times around, there is a large part of the IT and in particular security world who is very skeptical and very opposed to AI on
Hmm.
ethical reasons, on environmental reasons, on lots of reasons. Like there's probably a dozen reasons or more for that. And I personally may not disagree with a lot of them, but and I think there's a lot of comparison of whether people realize they're doing it or not. They're 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 looking at AI through the same lens they looked at blockchain.
Hmm.
It's a problem. It's trying to solve a problem that nobody really wants solved. Was how I think a lot of people looked at blockchain, and personally, I agree with that. But I think that I think AI is much more akin the way we looked at cloud, or the way we went through cloud. Where there, if you rewind the tape back 15 or 20 years ago, there was the same sort of furor to put, to cloud enable all of the apps. Like it was a, just a to some extent we still continue seeing it. Companies are still moving their stuff to SaaS, which is kind of a flavor of that. It's a consumption model, but there was kind of this irrational, let's just move everything in the cloud because that's like the cool thing to do, and our stock
Well,
price will benefit.
it's going to save us money. It's going to make us more agile and nimble,
Right.
and all of our competitors are doing it, so we've got to do it.
We have to do it. Right.
Yeah.
And that, that was the thing for a while, and it started to mediate. Like, you don't see that as, you don't buy a web browser, or not web browser, you don't buy web browsers anymore, but like a word processor. You don't buy a word processor because it is cloud based, or like
Right.
you don't buy software now because it's cloud based or not cloud based. That is just an artifact of, or an aspect or attribute of the thing that you're buying. It's not necessarily a selling point. And I think that we're on the same trajectory with AI, that there will be a moderation at some point where we won't. I mean, I don't think it's going away. Like, I think the tide has come
Yeah.
in, and I don't think it's going to go away. The tide will go back out a little bit, but like, it's here. It is here. We're going to see, not like a withdrawal of it, but I think we're going to see more focus on how to actually use it, constructively and effectively, and then manage around the risk of it. But I think over time, as it becomes less, people are sticking in every goddamn thing, whether it needs it or not. You know, we have to manage through it. And I
Yeah.
think,
It'll iterate
yeah.
and get refined, but it's not going away.
But
And
the concern I have is, this is all happening at a time, unlike cloud, right? This is all happening at a time when governments are getting much more. And this is not a, like, I'm, pooping on regulations, but it's happening at a time when worldwide governments are really coming to wake up to the risk of data security, data privacy, and whatnot. And so, I think there's this, like, the thing that is different now as opposed to what we saw with cloud is it's becoming more perilous. Like, you've got, if you don't manage it well, the downside, I think, is a lot more, it's a lot steeper than what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we have this bias for everything is always the worst possible situation because we're in the middle of it. And our generation is always in the worst possible situation, and we're always at the edge of calamity. I think
Yeah.
that there's a sociological aspect of that, which often the data doesn't prove out in a broad sense, right? And this is something I've harped on before. Like everyone's like, it's the worst possible timeline. I'm like, I don't know. The amount of people in poverty is the lowest it's ever been. Child mortality rate's the lowest it's ever been. Like I can point out a lot of things that like we've done a lot better. Access to clean water and a bunch of other things. Yeah, you can point out things that still suck, but some of the base core needs we've gotten a lot better at as a global society. Anyway, that's off topic.
I,
But
yeah, I'm not disputing that. I guess what I'm saying is it's threading the needle is harder because now it's not just about security, right? The problem that you have to navigate isn't just security. It's, you have to worry about the FTC and data
well, I
privacy
mean,
regulators.
I hate to be crass about it, but maybe some companies need to crash and burn for us to learn. And maybe that's the natural. And the other thing I want to mention that you were talking about earlier is the Gartner. You described the Gartner hype cycle perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you don't know the Gartner hype cycle, look it up. Like we are perfectly in the middle of that. And the way you describe cloud and how it evolved is the exact following that. I imagine AI is going to do the same thing. So I don't know. I guess maybe I'm being naive of, and I also feel like AI is being too broadly applied. Like everything in its brothers being labeled as AI, and I don't think it's all the same. And I think that'll shake out too. And the AI in my toothbrush is not the same as ChatGPT version 28 that's running our nuclear weapon systems for us. It's two different things.
Well, I think the risks are certainly not uniform. So,
Yeah.
for example, when your AI thing is sending data to some central offsite place, that presents a different set of risks. Like, you've got to make sure that you have the right kind of data protection stuff, contracts with whoever you're using. Otherwise, not only are you exposed to breaches, but you could run into regulatory problems. AI as a as a means to perform like business logic is also problematic. Like, this was when I was with my last job, we worked a lot with bank regulators, and I suspect you may have seen some of this too. And a lot of the regulations are around fairness and equity and things like that. And so when you take it away from a human and you put it onto some kind of AI machine to decide whether or not someone is eligible for a loan, or or what have you, that becomes that becomes a subject to scrutiny and oversight. And so there's a lot, I think there's lots of ways to step into the hole accidentally. We talked about the potential pitfalls with intellectual property and whatnot. So I think you raise a really good point, and that I was not thinking about it, right? Like, there's lots of different incarnations that we have to think through, and they're not all the same.
And to be clear, I think you're absolutely correct, and all those things are problematic. And I think, I guess the approach I'm taking is, yeah, that shit's going to break and we'll have to fix it. But maybe it has to break before we get this right. I don't want it to break. I'm not hoping it's going to break, but I guess I've resigned myself to like, yeah, that's going to happen. We're going to have situations like, oh yeah, this AI model denied everybody from this zip code because of whatever bias it has. all right, well, that informs the entire industry, and now new regulation comes into place, and for the next, we'll fix it, we'll get better, but in the short term, it's going to suck, and it's going to be unfair, and it's going to, but I mean, yeah, it'd be nice if we avoided those problems. I don't know. I don't know that we're going to avoid. I guess what I've resigned myself to, and I'm looking past this problem, is like we've already embraced this, and I think the only way to get better is to go through it, and that we are going to make a ton of mistakes and regret them and wish we had seen it first and wish we hadn't done it, but we're going to do it, and then we're going to get better at it. And hopefully it's not too painful as we learn that lesson.
So I think what you're saying is it'll be obvious in hindsight.
Yeah. And maybe hopefully we avoid some of this. And I know people are trying. I know there's some people who care. But I also know that the level of skill set applying AI across everything with a bit of code in it is not equal.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe I'm just tired and cranky and being fatalistic about AI.
I'm not sure you're being fatalistic as much as pragmatic.
Yeah, because I also see a lot of benefits that are undeniable. So, which is why I think it's not stop. I guess it's like I'm through the stages of grief and I'm into acceptance at this point, because like I don't disagree with a lot of these concerns people bring up. I'm like, yeah, but you're not going to stop it. It's too compelling. You're just not. So now we just have to brace for it and manage our way through it.
I think the question for me is, are there practical things that we can do to minimize the damage?
I don't know. You know me, I am not a fan of government regulation.
No,
I think they have a lot of.
So I don't mean. I'm not saying. I'm not saying government regulation. I'm talking about like, in the in the spirit of this article, they're talking about like having governance policies around AI and training your employees and whatnot. And I'm just not sure. Like, I think that can take you so far. But I think there's, as you've pointed out, I think there's this like super compelling argument combined with the reality that where AI is and is not necessarily super obvious in all instances. And so maybe like you can cut it off or mitigate it to some extent. But I guess on the other side, I think this might be an instance where this issue is going to be most problematic for the companies who ignore it and leave it up to their employees to go and do the innovation on their own, rather than the company providing the tools, that are acceptable to the company.
Yeah. The only caveat to that is the company's got to be responsive.
Yeah. But if they're not, if they're not, then it magnifies the problem, right? So it's right. It's going to be the responsive companies that are facilitating, employee expectations and requirements that have a hope in hell of minimizing, probably not eliminating, but minimizing this challenge. It's the ones that pretend like it doesn't exist that I think are going to see the biggest issues, where employees are just off, figuring out how to do it on their own.
Right. And it becomes an unmanageable mess.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, once again,
So look for our forthcoming book on AI governance. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
We're available for motivational keynote speaking.
It's an interesting time, and I think we have to think about it again like cloud. We're on the cusp of the next big IT. I mean, it's already here. Like it's not going away.
Yeah.
The people who succeed in their IT careers are the ones that help organizations manage through it, whatever that means, on the security side, on the consumption side. on the implementation side, and so, from a personal growth standpoint, just factor that in.
Yeah. Yeah. One underlying thing that I'm not saying out loud that I should is if your security team is just saying no, you're going to get run over by the business. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not effective and not helpful.
Your replacements will probably have a different
Right.
perspective.
And it doesn't matter how right you are. Right doesn't matter in this case. This is an undeniable movement that if you stand in the way of, you will not be a benefit to the company, is my opinion.
Yeah.
And
as with everything, that is not a uniform statement about every industry, every company, but I
sure.
think on average, that's the world we live in now.
Yeah.
So anyway, on that happy note, I think we shall
adjourn.
end the suffering. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Hopefully, you found that discussion interesting. I do want to point out, by the way, that I have started releasing each of these stories as individual segments in a YouTube playlist. So if you visit our YouTube channel, you can actually refer to without if you want to send a particular segment to a colleague or what have you. We now have that option available. Hopefully you find that useful. We're continuing to produce, more and more interesting things. We're doing daily, well, not for the past week, but daily kind of humorous, a little bit humorous updates. And, we'll continue to innovate. As Andy said, we're looking at doing some additional things for our sponsors or our Patreon sponsors. And anyway, we appreciate your time. I know there's lots of security podcasts out there, and hopefully we've added some value to you.
Absolutely. And we really do appreciate the listeners and the feedback and the comments. And YouTube's been an interesting experiment, like seeing what resonates and feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Like the analytics on YouTube are actually pretty wild. But it's also like a bit of a siren song to not chase the analytics too much. Like that's a conversation Jerry and I were just having before the show about, do you chase what YouTube tells you to chase, or do you, just do what you do? Anyway, if you like the show, drop us a note, tell a friend. We're trying to get our stats up and, make it something people find valuable. So we appreciate all the help and support.
Absolutely. And you can follow the show on the web at defensivesecurity.org. We have links to the audio and video versions of the podcast, as well as all of our back episodes, and links to the stories we talk about. You can find me on social media at Jerry at infosec.exchange, which is my Fediverse instance. And where can they find you?
I am also on infosec.exchange at Lerg, L-E-R-G, and also on X at Lerg, L-E-R-G. And if you are curious about the YouTube stuff, you can find YouTube under Defensive Podcasts, which we're not too high in the search rankings yet, but you'll find us pretty quickly if you go search for that on YouTube.
Yeah, and I'll throw a link to that into the notes for this episode as well. So thanks, everybody, and we will talk again. By the way, the next time we'll talk to you, it'll be 2025. So Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Stay safe.
Take care.
See you guys. Bye.